All right, everybody, we are going to go ahead and get started. Hi, and welcome to our Folklore and Resistance Roundtable with a bunch of absolutely fabulous people. So in case you don't know, my name is Dr. Brittany Warman.
And I'm Dr. Sarah Cleto.
And together we run the Carterhaugh School of Folklore and the Fantastic. But we are also award-winning folklorists, teachers, and writers with a combined 26 years in higher education and over 4 dozen publications. We love to teach creative souls how to re-enchant their lives through folklore. Today, we are joined by Dr. Margaret Yogam, Dr. Gina Jorgensen, Dr. Maria De Blasi, Daisy Alstone, and Terry Windling.
So if you have been around Carterhaugh for a while, you might be wondering where the chat is. Unfortunately, we do not have a live chat running today simply because there are so many of you. There is absolutely no way for us to keep up with it in real time. However, there is a Q&A tab underneath our heads that should be open, and you can click on that and type in a question or a comment at any time, and we will take a look at those after all of our fabulous speakers are done with their talks. So that is how today is going to roll. So a little bit about what we are doing here today and why we're doing it. So if you had told me and Brittany 10 years ago that we were going to organize a roundtable on folklore and resistance, something that is both intensely personal but also very political, for actual hundreds of people to watch on the internet, we would have laughed really, really hard and said that you definitely had the wrong girls. We are actually pretty introverted. We are literary academics, and we love fairy tales, and we hate conflict. Go figure.
But we fell in love with fairy tales and folklore because they showed us the world the way we imagined it could be.
And we started studying folklore because we wanted to know more.
We kept studying, learning, and asking questions because we realized that fairy tales and folklore do not just show us the world as we wished it was.
And we've stayed, and at this point have pretty much dedicated our lives to folklore because at the end of the day, it still gives us hope and a path forward.
So let's explain.
We grew up on books that just were bursting with magic. We read about princesses whose favor could turn the tide of battle, sorcerers so powerful they could rewrite fate, fairies that were equal part whimsy, malice, and goodwill. Paperback, leather-bound, tattered hardcovers with the library slips, like still stuck inside of the front cover. All of those were fair game, and we loved all of them.
We love them so much that we went to grad school and got our master's and then our PhDs, where we learned to see clearly something we'd always kind of known somehow in our bones. Folklore and stories of all kinds are always political. And by that, we don't mean that fairy tales have like some super literal political messages that you can uncode under the words. It's more like fairy tales might reinforce values or push back against cultural norms. They can reinscribe the status quo, and they can be a clarion call for rebellion.
It probably won't shock you to hear that we loved fairy tales of rebellion, the ones where princesses determined their own destinies, befriended dragons, and claimed magic as their own, where witches lived happily ever after, where a prince could fall in love with a princess or a prince.
We finished our degrees and started the Carterhaugh School because we believe that fairy tales and folklore are incredibly powerful. If folklore is the fabric of everyday life, then the weave of it tells us who made it and why. And maybe it can begin to tell us what to weave next.
When the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade a few weeks ago, we were absolutely gutted. As women with a whole slew of chronic conditions and disabilities, reproductive rights and bodily sovereignty have always been incredibly important to us. Our other blows followed, and we found ourselves enraged, and at our worst moments, we felt really hopeless.
But we fell back on stories. We fell back on folklore. We binged our favorite novels and poetry for comfort. We read personal narratives for perspective and empathy. And we also returned to work like Michael Jackson's The Politics of Storytelling, where he wrote that
storytelling is a vital human strategy for sustaining a sense of agency in the face of disempowering circumstances. To reconstitute events in a story is no longer to live those events in passivity, but to actively rework them, both in dialogue with others and within one's own imagination.
we know that stories and folklore of all kinds can offer strength and strategies. And we also know that we don't know everything, but we know that there's strength in numbers, which is why we invited all of you and our roundtable participants here today. We've asked these brilliant people to consider some of the ways that folklore can help us resist injustice, despair, and helplessness.
And with that, we would like to turn it over to them. So up first, we are thrilled to introduce Dr. Margaret Peggy Yogam, and she grew up in Pennsylvania German farmland, listening to her grandparents' stories. She founded the Folklore Studies program of George Mason University, where she taught for 36 years. She especially loved telling and encouraging her students to tell stories. She has published on folklore and gender, folk arts and politics, as well as on storytelling among the Inuit of Alaska, woodsmen's families in Maine, her own family, and more. Her book, All Kinds of Fur, Erasure Poems and New Translation of a Tale from the Brothers Grimm, was published by Deerbrook Editions in 2018. Co-founder of the American Folklore Society's Creative Writing and Storytelling section, she holds a PhD in English and Folklore from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. A founding member of Western Maine Storytelling, she tells legendary tales of the seen and the unseen. She makes her home with her geologist husband in the Western Mountains of Maine. You can find her online at margaretyogam.com. And I have to add, in addition to her official bio there, that Carterhaugh literally wouldn't exist without her. Brittany and I met in her folklore program that she founded, and also her encouragement and her way of teaching about folklore and imagining what folklorists can be and do in the world is largely responsible for why we're here. So thank you so much, Peggy, and please take it away.
Thank you. Thank you, Brittany. Thank you, Sarah. It's very good to be with you today, as always. And hello to everyone who's joined us. You know, folklore materials are the most multifaceted and the most subversive materials that I know about. And this afternoon, I want to share what I think are two possibilities for resistance: personal stories made of words and personal stories made material in resonant objects. Next, please. How to move people's hearts and minds as we talk with potential voters, friends, and family. The answer is to tell our personal stories. All of us, I'm sure, can share stories that have changed us. And today I want to add to that and tell you about research published in the journal Science in 2016 that asserts that personal stories can change votes. What you see here on this PowerPoint slide is the first page of a transcript for canvassers about transgender issues, written by Joshua Kalla and David Brookman. These two political science researchers compared levels of transgender phobia between two groups. A group that talked with a canvasser for about 10 minutes face-to-face and heard and told personal stories, versus a group that talked with a canvasser about another topic, in this case, recycling. The group that heard the stories about life as transgender showed more acceptance of transgender people 3 months later and voted likewise. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. What Kalla and Brookman found was that sharing personal stories was, as they said, gold. Canvassers told their own and someone else's personal story about coming out as transgender. Next, please. And canvassers elicited voters' personal stories. Voters rarely had stories about transgendered people, but the voters had stories about lesbian, gay, bisexual people who they cared about. And especially, voters had stories about what had happened to them personally when someone judged them based on race, religion, appearance, or status. The entire Kala Brookman guidebook is online as a free PDF, and so can you find their more recent studies. So, I have a friend running as a Democrat for a state Senate seat, and he wants to talk about tax inequality. I'm hoping to work on a story that I could use as a canvasser to talk about tax inequality and how it's affected my family through the generations. Next slide, please. Stories made material. When we need images for social justice actions, like protests, exhibits, memorials, folk arts can guide us. Next. When we take an object that means a lot to us and put it in a different context and present multiples of it, it will be powerful. Next, please. Often, we combine objects for effect. Next. Next. We put resonant objects at spontaneous memorials. Here, the memorial near the Pentagon. Next. After September 11th, 2001. Next. Next. These are resonant objects, objects haunted by story. Next. These are touchstones for personal stories. Next. Next. And the objects are so often fragments. Here, hands. Their fragmented presence reflects shouts about absence, grief, loss, and can be used to protest against what caused such absence, grief, and loss. Next. Fragments. Next. Fragments are so powerful. They witness and they literally remember. Next. You can see the hands on this Ukrainian protest sign in the lower left. Next. And from South Portland, Maine, gun violence protests. From hands to shoes. Now, how many of you have seen a bronzed baby shoe like this? Maybe your parents or grandparents made a pair for you. My parents made one for me, but just one shoe, one bookend bronzed baby shoe. There's probably a story there. Next. Next. Shoes are such resonant objects. Next. With multiple meanings, oftentimes entering our lives at different life stages, rites of passage, sexuality. Next. From my neck of the woods in rural Maine, shoes and boots are also touchstones for stories about work. Here, river drivers caulked boots with steel spikes in them so that men could work the logs down the rivers next. So important are these boots that people have carved miniatures and gigantics. And when a man might die on a river drive, crushed by logs, his mates would often hang up his boots on a nearby tree as a memorial. Next, one of the most resonant memorials and protests that use shoes is, of course, in the Holocaust Memorial Museum of Washington, D.C. Next, objects of memory, as we folklorists call them, from the research of Barbara Kirschenblatt-Gimlet. Here, the military uses helmets, guns, and of course, boots for memorials. Next, the memorial against the Iraq War, put throughout the United States by Quakers. Next, multiple meanings of shoes and feet in some cultures are an anathema and used for protests of their own. Next, the Code Pink protest of the Iraq War put tags on the shoes of Iraqi citizens. Next, gun violence has long used shoes for protest. This 1996 example shows from the Capitol steps. Next, and just a month ago, the actor Matthew McConaughey and his wife came to the White House with shoes. Next, poets write of shoes, of hands, of objects of memory, of resistance, of memory. Next, let us remember, let us carry our wondrous fragments and our personal stories, knowing their power, and go forth. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Peggy. Okay, so we're gonna move right along so we keep going. The next talk we are going to have is from Dr. Gina Jorgensen. So Dr. Gina Jorgensen studied folklore under Alan Dundes at the University of California, Berkeley, and went on to earn her PhD in folklore from Indiana University. She is the author of Folklore 101 and the forthcoming book, Fairy Tales 101, as well as numerous articles on various aspects of gender and sexuality in fairy tales. Her website is ginajorgensen.com. I will switch you over just right now.
Great, thank you. So I've got dueling laptop screens, so I will be reading my paper to one side so I don't get sidetracked and ramble too much. Before I begin, I'd like to deliver a content note for a discussion of some topics revolving around bigotry and violence, though not in any graphic detail. And I'd like to thank my dad for giving me the inspiration for this talk during a recent conversation. As Sandra Dolby writes in Literary Folkloristics and the Personal Narrative, it is the folklorist's charge to identify and describe tradition in the materials and processes of non-professional everyday activities. In my remarks here, that's exactly what I intend to do, utilizing personal narratives shared during the closing remarks of the January 6th committee hearings that met on July 12th. I plan to refer to folkloristic scholarship on personal narrative as well as feminist scholarship on entitlement with a few nods to my home base of fairy tale scholarship. I plan to argue that tradition is a resource and folk narrative is a tool for helping us think through social justice issues. And this is not a new idea, but I'm just doing some new things with it here. This is coming out of some of my recent scholarly work on the seemingly unconnected topic of gender transition in fairy tale retellings, as when these contemporary reworkings focus on either more magical or more social transitions for their transgender protagonists. These tales are admittedly a minority, and in an era of commodified, Disney-fied, heteronormative happily ever afters, it might seem incongruous to focus on the fairy tale's liberatory potential. But that's exactly what a lot of us assembled here today do. We look for the glimpses of emancipatory ideas in the traditional materials that surround us. As folklorist Henry Glassy states, tradition is the creation of the future out of the past. So it's not surprising that I'm observing a lot of trans and genderqueer authors using tradition, in this case fairy tales, as a resource from which to draw as they create their futures. Tradition gives us tools to explain who we are and what our values are, and to then converse with others on that very topic. Personal narrative sits at a kind of weird junction in this conversation. It is one of these sort of neglected stepchild genres of folklore. You know, we have our larger, more transnational genres: myth, legend, folktale and fairy tale, ballad, material culture, customary folklore. And so we tend to think of personal narratives as unique to the individual telling them, but also patterned by culture, because it is culture that tells us what a story is and also what a good story is. And so these personal narratives I'm going to talk about today, they're shaped by the twin laws of folklore, tradition and variation, as much as any other genre we might study, though they often skew more towards the individual and variation end of the spectrum than the group and tradition end of the spectrum. So to dive into some of these narratives shared during the closing remarks, I'm going to read these quotes in full, and they're kind of long. So Representative Stephanie Murray said, "This isn't about promoting ourselves as individuals. It's about protecting the country we love. And it's about preserving what actually makes America great: the rule of law, free and fair elections, and the peaceful transfer of power from one elected leader to the next. But if I may say a word about myself and why I'm proud to serve on this committee, I'm the only member of this committee who is not blessed to be born an American. I was born in Vietnam after the Vietnam War, and my family and I fled a communist government and were rescued by the US Navy and were given sanctuary in America. My patriotism is rooted in my gratitude for America's grace and generosity. I love this country. On January 6th, 4 decades after my family fled a place where political power was seized through violence, I was in the United States Capitol fleeing my fellow Americans." And now a snippet from Representative Benny Thompson. "I am from a part of the country where had it not been for the federal government and the Constitution, my parents and many more Americans like them would have continued to be treated as second-class citizens. The freedom to be able to vote without harassment, to travel in relative safety, and dine and sleep where you choose is because we have a government that looks over the well-being of its citizens." These two personal narrative texts utilize what I'm terming specificity rather than specters, punching up rather than punching down, and obligation rather than entitlement. These stories are rooted in the personal and familial experiences of their narrators. They happen in specific times and places, rather than invoking the specter of whatever latest fear is haunting us. This makes personal narrative contrast with conspiracy theory or fake news, which as genres purport to deal in specificity, but instead give us what I'm calling specters, unreal manifestations that prey on our fears without any substance to back them up. These narratives identify real injustices, and instead of punching down and mocking or harming those victimized by injustices, the narratives that I've just shared point out the power imbalances at work, thereby subtly punching up instead. So there's three axes I'm going to talk about: entitlement versus obligation, punching up versus punching down, specificity versus specters. I'm going to go a bit more into those and also talk about how you can use them. I follow feminist philosopher Kate Mann in thinking through entitlement as a pressing inequality issue. While Mann looks at it from the lens of misogyny, her insights apply here too. In her recent book entitled, she writes of traditionally feminine goods, such as sex, care, nurturing, and reproductive labor, that men feel entitled to take, and which women must act entitled to give, or else there are consequences. So problems arise when this interaction is not followed to the letter. Mann writes, and I quote, "When a woman fails to give a man what he supposedly owed, she will often face punishment and reprisal, whether from him, his empathetic supporters, or the misogynistic social structures in which she is embedded. What's more, within the system, women are often unfairly deprived of their genuine entitlement to both feminine coded and masculine coded goods," end quote. And in case you're not familiar with Mann's term empathy, that refers to the sort of disproportionate skewing of empathy towards a man who has overreached in some entitled fashion and then is like, oh, he's the wronged one, we should feel sorry for him. And I find this notion of entitlement and the corresponding sense of empathy when we react to instances where entitlement is overreached to be very useful. So I quote at length here to distinguish between what Mann describes as unjust entitlement and genuine entitlement. The entitlement, on the one hand, of the oppressor to undeserved goods and opportunities versus the entitlement, on the other hand, of the marginalized to deserved goods and opportunities. This latter genuine entitlement I am calling obligation. We are obligated to care for one another within a fair society, just as we are obligated to care for the earth we inhabit. Community is a network of intertwined obligations in a good way, not in a, I have to do my chores kind of a way. My thinking on entitlement is again shaped by fairy tale discourse. My colleague Linda Lee has explored an interpretation of Beauty and the Beast tales, wherein the beast is entitled to Beauty's affection and love as a means of disenchantment. This is unjust entitlement, and using a fairy tale lens can help us identify the underlying dynamics when it comes to entitlement. Fairy tales also provide a view into what I'm terming punching up versus punching down, or in other words, being aware of who's actually impacted by the discourse and how much power they actually have. Fairy tales so often ask us to empathize with the downtrodden protagonists, such as orphan children and abuse victims, but sometimes they don't. What are we supposed to do with protagonists like the servant in the Grimm's text, The Jew in the Thornbush, who happily tortures people, including a Jewish man? Clearly, fairy tales are not paragons of social justice, but through fairy tales, we can learn to hone our sense of when the tale is asking us to empathize with those who have more or less power in a given instance. It benefits us to combine this knowledge of narrative structure with an awareness of historically excluded and oppressed populations so that we don't accidentally laugh at jokes that punch down. When we use our cutting wit, we should use it instead to punch up, to critique those with power who are choosing not to share it or to actively abuse it. Unfortunately, this last example, and it's certainly not the only example of an anti-Semitic fairy tale out there, it shows that tradition is not always a resource for good. Storytelling alone will not save us. As my colleague Christy Wilsey points out in her research on the personal narratives of veterans, your personal stories are the currency by which you access care, and other people's lies could, like counterfeit coins, cheapen or dilute your truth. So we do sometimes have a competing marketplace of stories that will come into conflict with one another, which introduces more complexity in how we relate to stories. If some stories contain truths, others are explicit lies. And as Kate Mann points out in the first chapter of Entitled, the personal narratives that competed during the Supreme Court hearing to confirm Brett Kavanaugh let the abuser's narrative triumph over that of the abused. Sharing her story did not necessarily help Dr. Christine Blasey Ford persuade those making the decision, and it might have even endangered her. So even though I think hewing close to personal narrative is overall a good move these days, it is not guaranteed to save the day. And even for those of us who are dedicated story lovers and storytellers, we should probably maintain some skepticism and sometimes even distance from the notion that stories will always triumph, because context matters too. One potential takeaway that you can use is these 3 concepts to help analyze narratives that come your way, whether their source is a friend, a news station, the internet, pop culture, or what have you. You can look for how much the speaker or protagonist expresses entitlement or obligation. Are they demanding goods and services to which they are truly entitled from like a universal human rights perspective? You can examine the power structures inherent in the world their story has created and try to ascertain if they are punching up or punching down. And finally, you can interrogate the specificity of the characters and experiences from the narrative. Is someone speaking from personal or familial experience, or are they invoking the specter of the other, which can take any form depending on someone's worldview? Is the threatening yet always unspecified other? It might be immigrants, Jewish, transgender people, queer people, take your pick. And the current moral panic on grooming children is a great example of this. The fear, as I understand it, is that openly queer people, like, hey, I'm a teacher, I have a photo on my desk or whatever, openly queer people are grooming children to be just like them or to be the perfect victim or whatever. But the question is, who are they? Like, can you name a single person doing this? If the answer is no, we're probably in moral panic territory. And pointing this out won't necessarily win you arguments with any fanatics, but it could help grant clarity to observers and position you as more of an ally for any marginalized people listening in. So, bouncing a bit between personal narrative and fairy tale, I have argued that tradition is a resource that people use to stake a claim to valid human rights obligations. But sometimes people twist narrative to their own ends, using it to punch down rather than punch up. Hopefully, you can use my 3-part analytical tool, entitlement versus obligation, specificity versus specters, punching up versus punching down, to try to identify these themes when they emerge in narratives close to you. And on a closing note, I'm sorry I had to say punching so much in this talk because I'm a pretty nonviolent person. And clearly I mean it metaphorically, but I also think it's helpful to remember that some of the social injustices here are enacted on bodies in very real physical ways. When we think about resistance and folklore and resistance, we must remember that for all that folklore is often trivialized and marginalized and kind of shoved to the side in a lot of areas of life, the stakes are often very high. So whatever your chosen weapon is, analytical words, persuasive words, creative words, and more, come ready to fight, because those who would deny us our rights, our basic human rights, they're sure as hell ready to fight. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gina. That was so fantastic. I feel like I got a lot of clarity, and that was a really, really useful framework. So thank you. All right, up next, I am delighted to introduce Dr. Maria De Blasi, who is a native New Mexican mestiza and award-winning writer and educator living in the land of enchantment. She writes wonderfully about everyday magic, ordinary Gothic, and all things witchy. When she is not practicing brujeria, she is teaching classes about bodice rippers, modern mystics, and things that go bump in the night. She is forever looking for magic in her life and somehow always finding more than she thought was there. You can find out more about Maria and conjuring everyday magic at mariadeblasi.com. So welcome, Maria. It is a pleasure to have you here.
Hi, thank you so much for having me, everyone, and just brilliant talks all around. And thank you so much, Sarah and Brittany, for putting this together. So today I'm talking about what it means to conjure change by rewriting trauma narratives and looking for moments of hope. And I'm talking about this through some of my own personal journeys through that. So storytelling has always been, and I'm reading from my sheet here, so that's why I'm looking down, sorry. Storytelling has always been one of the most profound acts of magic making, the most beautiful and healing of spells, the thing I turn to when I need to conjure a new way of being in this complicated, fraught world. As a New Mexican mestiza, a woman of mixed race heritage, Indigenous and Hispanic primarily, so many stories about people like me are ones of trauma. be it ancestral, generational, or rooted in systemic oppression. And let's be real, sometimes we go through things in life, just run-of-the-mill daily stuff, that can make us feel closed off, perpetually trying to protect ourselves from further injury. And that is no way to live. So when I put pen to paper, I conjure change, a shift away from these trauma narratives toward narratives of joy and hope. And this is especially important when perpetuating trauma narratives can be a way of reinforcing systemic oppression. So it's taken me a long time to find stories of people who are like me, living like happy lives. And not that they're everything goes smoothly for them, but that they get what they call in romance an HEA, or a happily ever after, or fairy tale happily ever after. So as I explain the spell work of writing in my short prose poem, My Joy is My Resistance, from my first book, Everyday Enchantments, this is what this looks like for me. I let my hands relish the feel of my dreams being coaxed to life between my fingers like the red clay of my beloved desert. I mold the clay and I love the earth and shape it into stories they do not want me to tell. The ones of hope, the ones of healing, the ones that remind us of the moon's power and our own capacity for abundance and possibility. In fact, all of Everyday Enchantments was written because I was trying to figure out what happiness looks like and what it feels like day to day. And to do that, I had to reimagine my life as a sort of fairy tale, a place where the mystic could be found in the mundane, where synchronicities and archetypal messages were as common as fairy godmothers and enchanted objects. And the struggles I went through were obstacles, foes that needed to be fought, but that could be resolved or figured out. In essence, I started focusing on life as a form of lived folklore, like the fairy tales and stories I grew up reading. I was on my own journey of discovery. Only instead of saving Middle Earth, or traveling to Narnia, or making friends with all the songbirds of the forest, I was relearning the magic of everyday life. So folklore and the imagination became a lifeline for me, a way to imagine happiness and fulfillment in a world that doesn't want people like me to have it. Or it can seem like things can be stacked against us. And we, of course, internalize that. One of the ways I conjured the sense of joy in a fraught world was in examining my relationship to pleasure. Pleasure can teach us so much about ourselves. Think about it. In a world that always feeds the negative, and then which our own fears can magnify, we have to remember that pleasure is a valuable healing tool. It's something we have to actively nourish and celebrate, like 12 dancing princesses sneaking off each night to dance in an enchanted kingdom, only to return to their daily assumed struggles, whatever princesses struggle with. And of course, I'm really simplifying the tale of the 12 dancing princesses here, but growing up, I loved that story because there was this sense of them escaping into an enchanted world at night. But pleasure is also something we can feel disconnected from when we go on autopilot in an effort to cope with the world around us and our own inner turmoils. So we can start dissociating and not being in tune with our emotions, including our ability to kind of work through stuff and experience joy. So healing our relationship to pleasure can help us process difficult emotions and get real about what we want in life. Abundance, meaningful relationships, you name it. You see this play out in my Gothic fairy tales too, like Weep, Woman, Weep, based on the legend of La Llorona. So for those of you who don't know La Llorona, or the Weeping Woman, she's this urban legend that terrifies a lot of Hispanic communities, especially the kids. And basically it is the spirit of a woman who drowns her children in a fit of rage and spends all of the afterlife roaming the Rio Grande or whatever waterway you find, searching for her kids. So the way it went was, if you're out alone at night as a kid along a waterway, be careful or La Llorona will get you. So I have my own spin on this tale in Weep, Woman, Weep, where La Llorona only drowns girls so that they come back and live lives as sorrowful as her own. La Llorona wants to perpetuate these ancestral traumas brought on by colonization. She wants to perpetuate those pains she's had to live through. So she's pushing this cycle forward. The protagonist of this novella, Mercy, begins her story by telling us, "I am built for tears. It's in my blood. The women in my life don't know how to have a life without sorrows." In this story, Mercy survives an encounter with the weeping woman. She's the only one to do so, from what she knows. She survives, but she doesn't come back quite right. Her tears now have the power to hurt, or she later finds heal. She discovers that when she cries, bad things start happening, depending on whatever she's thinking about. So she has to be very careful with what she's thinking and feeling when she cries. So she starts in a really dark place. She's dealing with generational trauma, ancestral hauntings, and the history of colonization and enforced cultural assimilation written in her blood. But, and this is crucial, she chooses to define herself outside of those things. Through her focus on pleasure, the things that make her happy, the things that define and shape her outside of these traumas, Mercy comes into her own and eventually finds a love so strong that not even La Llorona can break it. So Mercy's pleasures are small, like trashy novels and pretty rocks, and really, really good turnips and listening to old records. And they're big pleasures too, like building a thriving farm from the ground up and nurturing her magical ability with plants. There are also unexpected pleasures, like the sweet lemon balm soap made for her by a man who was half angel and half wildcrafter. And sometimes, her pleasures allow her to process her pain as she reconciles herself to the fact that La Llorona has irrevocably changed her life, but that she still has a life to live. Through these experiences of pleasure, she learns that she is not just some weed, but a seed. By the end of the tale, she is no longer a victim of La Llorona or the often whispered about evil witch in her small town of Sueño, New Mexico, but Miracle Mercy, the woman who can change fates, the woman who has turned her grief into joy. So this transformation sneaks up on her. She's been working toward it every day, but she's never quite able to see the big picture until after she's developed some magical relationships. And these are with people working through their own internalized oppression and history of colonization. There's a moment near the end of her story where she sees this wonderful, abundant life she's created for herself. She's been so focused on the little pleasures and the small acts of moving forward from her family's trauma, but she hasn't quite seen all she's accomplished, the big picture, until now. As Mercy explains on what it's taken for her to find joy, she says, La Llorona was the weeping woman, sure, but I am the woman who makes rainwater out of tears. I would use them to water my crops through this drought. When people bought my fat turnips and sharp radishes and long, thick carrots, they would taste of freshly turned earth and freshly turned futures. Hope, the bittersweet taste of things past, and the salty tang of possibility. This I would do to remind others that we are the seeds we plant, not the histories forced upon us. This I would do to wash away the sorrow from my soul. Was I scared? You bet. But nothing makes a woman brave except living. So here we have an end, at the end of this Gothic fairy tale, another transformation. A girl turned weeping woman turned miracle worker. Through the simple act of turning away from feeding and perpetuating trauma and learning, one small step at a time, what it means to embody joy and abundance. In fact, the joy of folklore is that it can be, when done intentionally, a form of resistance, of changing the kinds of stories we tell about ourselves and our communities. It helps us choose magic and possibility, again, the word possibility, over stifling conventions that would regulate our bodies and our minds. So to wrap things up, I want to leave you with a meditation or ritual to help you when things get difficult, to remind you that you are the author of your own story and nobody can take that from you. Or as Mercy puts it, that we are the seeds we plant, not the histories forced upon us. So this exercise is fairly simple, but it helps me a lot when I get too in my head, which is, a problem if you're working in academia. It happens a lot, getting in your head. So when you get too in your head and I need to ground myself, but think about something that brings you joy, like a simple pleasure. It can be anything. For Mercy, it's listening to old records and reading trashy novels. Those are simple pleasures of mine as well. Now visualize that simple pleasure as sacred. It's not just something you do for fun. It's not a bonus. It's a necessity. Resist the temptation to trivialize it. There's no room for guilty pleasures here. So you can do this one of two ways. You can visualize, or you can write down the details about it, depending on what works best for you and what feels most soothing. But think about your sacred, simple pleasure down to the last detail. How it makes you feel, why you look forward to it, just all the little aspects of it. As you do, imagine the story it tells about you. How does it soothe, heal, transform? What emotions emerge as you meditate on this pleasure? And these emotions don't always have to be pleasurable either. Sometimes enjoyment can give us a safe space or help us relax enough to process difficult emotions. Lastly, imagine yourself as your favorite fairy tale character. I'm personally very fond of thinking of myself as a hobbit, or you can think of who you would be as a folklore protagonist. Imagine it down to the last detail, including how your sacred, simple pleasure fits into your quest or journey. What magic does it offer you? What wisdom or insights to help you conquer your foes or inner dragons? How does it help you transform your tears into rainwater? So in closing, always remember to reword what Mercy said a little bit. Nothing makes a person brave except living. And to add to that, miracles don't happen unless you show up every day, ready to work magic. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria. That was wonderful. Thank you so much. Okay, so we are going to transfer over to Daisy Alstone. They study ecological metaphor through a lens of folklore, post-humanism, and participatory action research and project design. They collaborate on several folklore and community-centered projects, including the Livelihoods Knowledge Exchange Network, the Western States Folklore Society, and is the director of a YouTube and Twitch streaming channel called Folkwise, which brings the discipline of folklore to community-engaged digital platforms. Thank you so much for being here, Daisy.
Yeah, thank you for that introduction. Hello, attendants. I feel your presence and appreciate you all taking the time out of your day to share some space with us virtually and listen to all of these wonderful speakers. I'm beaming to you today from the ancestral and contemporary lands of the Shawnee, Potawatomi, Delaware, Miami, Peoria, Seneca, Wyandotte, Ojibwe, and Cherokee peoples, but what is more commonly known as Columbus, Ohio. I'm here today to get us thinking about the connections between folklore and ecology as they inform our senses of community. I began my interest in the study of folklore as an undergraduate, searching for answers to the parts of building relationships with people that I didn't really understand. So why did people have opinions on how long Christmas lights should be up? Or how text, speak, emojis, playful language added to my ability to communicate with my friends, but didn't necessarily work with my parents or colleagues, and how should I know which one to choose? Why should I believe certain authorities over others in regards to my daily medical care, as I was in an environment that paid respect and credibility to homemade remedies? I began to see folklore facilitating questions about normative behaviors and power. While I first thought folklore was only about fairies, costumes, and dancing, it was the answers that I began to find to these questions through the discipline that led me to stay. Now I see folklore as a tool of resistance to things like isolation and helplessness, because it centers the little creative ways that we express our relationships with one another every day. Fast forward to today, I've expanded on these earlier questions into thinking about the formation of community and our responsibility to it, particularly in connection to more than human beings and ecology. Ecology is all about noticing and describing the relationships between different organisms and their physical environments. These relational networks influence the movement of ecosystems, which we're all a part of, no matter how intentional or conscious our contributions to it. When we take a daily walk, we might carry unsuspecting pollen to other plants to fertilize. When we spend time with our pets, we learn more about how they see the world and how they in turn shape our shared space inside and outside our home, uniting and expanding the boundaries of what home might mean to us. I define folklore in my work today as the creative communication of everyday life. It's the skull emoji you type instead of haha or lol, which might both indicate that you died of laughter, but also are probably Gen Z or spending a lot of time with them. It could be the TikTok plant tour that you made to share with your friends because you became a plant parent overnight, like so many of us during the pandemic, and hope to bring a little bit more life and care into your home. These two disciplines come together for me as an interest in the expressions that we share between ourselves and others of all kinds in small, everyday interactions that shape our sense of self and participation in community. So a roundtable on folklore and resistance asks us to question what we're resisting in the first place. A collective sense of helplessness, anxiousness, and isolation seems to be at the forefront for conversations around feeling these days. The causes are seemingly unending, and you can basically open up any social media platform or forum and get caught up on listicles, trending hashtags, and news that will either deepen those feelings for you or give solutions and ideas and directions and actions. And you kind of just end up in an entangled mess sometimes, looking at your screen, interacting with hundreds of people and never quite feeling seen. I don't want to linger on the isolation or helplessness to act that we might feel in that space, but rather notice and wonder how thinking with folklore and ecology might shape our senses and help us engage more actively with our world to facilitate our happiness, joy, and confidence in our ability to simply be people. Folklore helps us find meaning in the seemingly mundane, the things we do every day that make our worlds and look more and more beautiful the closer you lend the microscope. For me, connections between folklore and ecology create opportunities for resistance through deepening our everyday relationships with humans and more than human beings in the face of that helplessness and isolation. I see the connections between us in vast networks, some with stronger branches than others, influencing our worlds both consciously and affectually through the content we like to share on Twitter, or the recycled planter box we made in the front yard, or the notes our partner leaves us on the counter that always have that inside joke reference that just makes our heart go, oh. Noticing these small moments of creative communication in our day really helps re-enchant our world for ourselves and the others that we share in it. The point I aim to make here is that we're all part of communities and we're more creatively connected to them than we might realize at first glance. The stronger the connecting threads, the more durable the quilt. When you understand yourself as part of a network, a system, every fluctuating body of beings interacting to create and sustain and restore and transform, it's almost impossible to feel isolated and helpless in a world that sometimes it seems like it's out to get us and our loved ones, separating and dividing rather than bringing us together and noticing our collective energy. Acting together and deepening those relationships makes networks stronger, and that strength ripples between all of us. Just like in our ecosystems, crisis creates change, and the changes transition through small, sometimes microscopic, creative acts of relationality. So something for you to take away from the energy that we're kind of creating together in this space is to get to know a new being in your life. This being could be human, non-human, someone you share a common language with or not, but some being that you share community with, no matter the scale. Spend time noticing and wondering about this someone. Ask them questions or think through questions you have alongside them. Spend time together. Literally put in your calendar, whatever calendar app you use, like 1 hour to connect. That's important and no one does it anymore. And it really has brought a lot of joy and significance to my life, especially when we think about connection in these small ways. It doesn't have to be a big thing. It can be really small. To quote one of my favorite activists, Adrienne Marie Brown, move at the speed of trust. Relationality and being reflective about your everyday relationships is an act of resistance to isolation that folklore and ecology together can teach us and is a simple place to start. In addition to this more formal takeaway, I have a Google Doc that includes all my contact information for you all, as well as a list of texts that I have stacked here in the background that I have found particularly influential in thinking about these subjects together. So that way you can check those out for later if you're interested. I like categorize them a little bit by subject so it's not so overwhelming. And Brittany and Sarah will be sending that in the follow-up email. But for now, if you'd like to connect, you can contact me at Thyla_Daisy, THYLA_DAISY across like all social media platforms. And I just really appreciate you all sharing space with us today. Thank you.
Daisy, you're so cool.
Oh my God. Wow.
You're all so cool. That was fantastic. Thank you so much. Brittany and I are like, you know, sending like little messages to each other in the background while this is happening, being like, everyone is amazing. This is all so good. So please know that we're all like geeking out about all of you. But yes, thank you so much, Daisy. That was really, really wonderful. All right, next up, we are totally thrilled to welcome Terry Windling, who is a writer, editor, artist, and folklorist specializing in fantasy literature and mythic arts. She has published over 40 books, receiving 9 World Fantasy Awards, and we just found out that she just won another one, so I guess a total of 10. The Mythopoeic Award for her wonderful novel, The Woodwife, and the SFWA Solstice Award for Life Achievement. She has edited fantasy fiction since the 1980s and published numerous anthologies of magical stories, including 16 volumes in the year's Best Fantasy and Horror series and 6 volumes in the Snow White, Blood Red series of adult fairy tales, which were co-edited with Ellen Datlow. She also writes fiction for adults and children, nonfiction on folklore and fairy tales, and a really wonderful long-running blog called Myth and More. A former New Yorker, Terry now lives with her British husband, a theater director and puppeteer, in a small Dartmoor village full of artists. They have 1 grown daughter, an elderly dog, and a tiny house crowded with books and puppets. Thank you so much for being here, Terry. Welcome.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thank you and Brittany for inviting me. This, just listening to all my wonderful folklore colleagues talk so brilliantly about this subject has been very, very inspiring. And please bear with me, folks. It's 8 o'clock at night here on Dartmoor, and I'm not a night person, so I'm going to stumble a little bit more than I would normally in presentation. I'm going to talk in more generalities about what I've done today. I know I'm preaching to the choir when I talk about, with this audience, when I talk about why stories are important. But during these dark times, we're all feeling so battered by the news and by everything going on, both in America and England and around the world. I think it's good to be reminded of why these things we love so much, these texts, aren't trivial. They are important. They are valuable in our lives. And if I do nothing else tonight, I'd like to just be here reminding you that folktales are good things to care about, even while the world is on fire. So, get my text up. This conversation, how the stories of folklore and myth help us navigate dark times, is one I seem to be involved with often of late, and that's hardly a surprise considering the perilous times we're living through. Although I would argue that each generation faces peril in one form or another, collective peril or personal trauma, and some survive and some do not. And that is precisely why the old tales of journeys through the dark of the fairy tale woods are told and retold again and again. Folk and fairy tales from all around the world speak unflinchingly about the darkest parts of life, particularly the lives of women, the poor, the traveling peoples, and other disenfranchised populations. These tales address such timeless concerns as poverty, power, domestic violence, incest, rape, arranged marriages, the effects of remarriage on family dynamics, the loss of inheritance or identity, and the survival of calamity. They address the power of transformation, about how one finds the courage to fight and prevail against overwhelming odds, whether the fight is to save a world or a single life or one's own soul. Stories well told are not trivial things. Stories teach, challenge, console, refresh. They examine the world and reimagine the world. They remind us of what courage looks like and hope. They explain us to each other. They explain us to ourselves. They feed us, heal us, confound us, and shake us out of complacency or despair. The British Nigerian author Ben Okri writes, the earliest storytellers were magi, seers, bards, griots, shamans. They were, it would seem, as old as time and as terrifying to gaze upon as the mysteries with which they wrestled. They wrestled with those mysteries and transformed them into myths, which coded the world and helped the community to live through one more darkness, with eyes wide open and hearts set alight. I think now, says Okri, in our age, with certainties collapsing around us and with no beliefs by which to steer our way through the dark descending nights ahead, I think we now need those fictional old bards and fearless storytellers, those seers. We need their magic, their courage, their love, and their fire more than ever before. It is precisely in a fractured, broken age that we need mystery and a reawoken sense of wonder. But there's also danger in stories, warns the American essayist Scott Russell Sanders. He says, as in any great force, there is danger in stories. If the tales that captivate us are silly or deceitful, like most of those offered by television or advertising, they waste our time and warp our desires. If they are cruel, they make us callous. If they are false and bullying, instead of drawing us into a thoughtful community, they may lure us into an unthinking herd, or worst of all, into a crowd screaming for blood. In which case we need other, truer stories to renew our vision. So the Diary of Anne Frank and Primo Levi's Survival in Auschwitz are antidotes to Mein Kampf. So Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man and Toni Morrison's Beloved are antidotes to the paranoid yarns of the Ku Klux Klan. So the patient exchange of stories between people searching for common ground is an antidote to the hasty sloganeering and slandering of talk shows. At the Once and Future Fantasy Conference in Glasgow last week, Marina Werner gave an insightful keynote speech discussing the power, but also the danger of stories. We're living in a time when certain politicians, broadcasters, religious leaders, climate change denialists, and others are busy spinning bright, harmful, false stories for political or financial gain. In order to counter these slippery, harmful stories, we must tell our own, rooted in truth. Now, speaking to a room full of fantasy and folklore scholars, Marina suggested that our job in these dispiriting political times is to reoccupy narrative. Reoccupy narrative. I love that phrase. As an old activist friend of mine would say with relish, those are fighting words. Because if those of us who love magical stories, from old folk tales to modern fantasy fictions, if we can't create new narratives with which to reimagine and re-enchant the world, who can? The Kiowa writer N. Scott Momaday has said, words are intrinsically powerful, and there is magic in that. Words come from nothing into being. They're created in the imagination and given life on the human voice. You know, he says, we used to believe, and I'm talking about all of us, regardless of our ethnic background, in the magic of words. The Anglo-Saxon who uttered spells over his field so that the seeds would come out of the ground on the sheer strength of his voice knew a good deal about language, and he believed absolutely in the efficacy of language. That man's faith, and may I say wisdom, has been lost upon modern man by and large. It survives, says Momaday, in the poets of the world. I suppose, the singers. We do not now know what we can do with words, but as long as there are those among us who try to find out, literature will be secure. Literature will be a thing worthy of our highest level of human being. Like Momaday, I believe words have a magic and a power of their own, which those of us who work with words, as writers, as scholars, as storytellers, would be wise to remember. The tropes of folk and fairy tales especially come freighted with meaning on a metaphoric level. These are ancient, subtle, potent things, and they work in mysterious ways. But I want to stop and reflect for a moment that all of us are storytellers, not just those of us who do it for a living. All of us tell stories every day, recounting our lives, conversing with others, shaping our own inner narratives. We all use word magic every single day. And the words we use, the stories we tell, the ways we choose to interpret the world, the things we notice and the things we ignore, the narrative themes we relate to and those we push away, all of this is a form of spinning tales, creating our lives, affecting the lives around us, shaping the world in both ways, both large and small. Word magic is a power we all hold and that we could all use just a little bit better than we do. But now I have to pause again because that phrase word magic is important. Language is important, but words aren't the only form of communication that holds potency and power. To speak only of words is to privilege human speech over all the other kinds of communication in our interconnected world. The American eco-philosopher David Abram notes, human speech is simply part of a much broader conversation. Myriad things are also listening or attending to various signs and gestures around them. Indeed, when we are at ease in our animal flesh, we will sometimes feel that we are being listened to or sensed by earthly surroundings. And so we take deeper care with our speaking, mindful that our sounds may carry more than a merely human meaning and resonance. This care, this full-bodied alertness, is the ancient ancestral source of all word magic. It is the practice of attention to the uncanny power that lives in our spoken phrases to touch and sometimes transform the tenor of the world's unbuilding. How monotonous, adds David, our speaking becomes when we speak only to ourselves, and how insulting to other beings, to foraging black bears and twisted old cypresses that no longer sense us talking to them, but only about them, as though they were not present in our world. Now for me, the magic of folk and fairy tales, set as they are in realms far away and once upon a time, that magic is an invitation to reacquaint ourselves with the magic of the world we live in, and the myriad stories, human and more than human, unfolding all around us. The late, great American naturalist Barry Lopez once said, "I believe in all human societies, there is a desire to love and be loved, to experience the fullness of human emotion, and to make a measure of the sacred part of one's life. Wherever I've traveled, Kenya, Chile, Australia, Japan, I found the most dependable way to preserve these possibilities is to be reminded of them in stories. Stories do not give instruction. They do not explain how to love a companion or how to find God. They offer instead patterns of sound and association, of event and image. Suspended as listeners and readers in these patterns, we might reimagine our lives. It is through story that we embrace the great breadth of memory, and that we can distinguish what is true, and that we may glimpse, at least occasionally, how to live without despair in the midst of the horror that dogs and unhinges us. There's a great deal of horror out in the world right now. The path through the dark heart of the forest is long and treacherous, but we know this tale. We've heard it before, over and over and over again. Keep your wits about you, be kind to strangers, learn how to distinguish friend from foe, pluck up your courage and keep on going. Our stories will light the way. Now, the action I want to leave you with is about this fairy tale we're living, this journey into the dark of the woods. Let's think about the roles we play here. There are those who are comfortable at the center of the story, the heroes who set boldly off on adventure, quick to act, quick to speak, quick to determine right from wrong. Then there are those at the edge of the story, the helpers along the way, the old woman at the side of the road, the bird that separates lentils from stones, or those in the shadows of the wood who remain unseen as the hero passes by. The center of the story, they are not in the center of the story. They play their part and then step aside. Now think about which kind of character you tend to be, by inclination or personality, hero or helper. You're probably somewhere on the spectrum in between. I tend toward being a helper myself. I'm always the old woman at the side of the road, offering the magic walnut, gesturing into the hut with food for the weary hero traveling on. But whatever you are, whatever character you most tend to be in the story of your life, take a moment and place yourself in this fairy tale I'm weaving here. Now here's the action I'm asking for. I'm asking that sometime in the days or weeks ahead, you consciously take the opposite role. If you're a hero striding forward, then stop, be quiet, still. Think about the ways you can help another and not be the center of the story. If you're used to being a helper or some other secondary role, or at the margins or invisible, I ask you to find a moment in the days or weeks ahead when you take center place, speak boldly, loudly, and accept all the magical gifts that are given as your due. It takes courage, a fairy tale quality, to embody another role in life than the ones we're habitually used to. But it also has real value in helping us to understand each other, to have compassion for each other, and to support each other, to allow the heroes among us not to be strong once in a while, and to make room for everyone's story, even the smallest and quietest among us. Let's shake up this fairy tale we're living in, turn it topsy-turvy and see what happens. Let's see what kind of tale we can create together. And then let's carry on through the fairy tale woods, arm in arm, equals, shifting the roles back and forth. Let's create a new world, a new tale. Oh, thank you.
Terry, thank you so much. That was absolutely brilliant and so needed right now. Thank you. Okay.
Yes, thank you so much. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, I know. I'm just like, I'm reeling with just all of the awesome and all of the ideas. And thank you so much, not only for your talks, but for the action items that you gave us for at the end of all of your talks. Yeah, they were all really good, because they're things that you can do, they're bite-sized, but they're things that I think genuinely will really, really help. So we appreciate so much all of the time and thought and care that you put into this. And we're just blown away by all of you. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so we are going to go ahead and open things up a little bit to different questions in the Q&A. So let me decenter Sarah and I, and we will center all of us back on the screen. And let's see here. Where would you like to start, Sarah?
I am pulling up the Q&A now.
Okay.
Okay. All right, the first question we have here says, it's from Allison Lake, and she says, how do we fight for the environment in our capitalistic, patriarchal culture that resists seeing the other as valid? And that is a very important question, also a very big question.
Yes.
Would anyone on the roundtable like to take a first stab at it? Again, it is, how do we fight for the environment in our capitalistic, patriarchal culture that resists seeing the other as valid? And I think some of your action items already spoke to this a bit, but if anyone would like to elaborate.
Okay, I'll start.
Thank you, Terry.
Thank you for bravery.
I want to pull up, let me see if I can pull up a quote. I am a great lover of quotes, as you might have known, but I was just reading a piece by, I'm not going to be able to find it, a piece by Scott Russell Sanders that really spoke to me about this. Here we go. Sorry, guys.
No, please take your time.
Fine, yeah.
I can't find it. But what he talked about is how, so particularly in American culture, because that's what he's most familiar with, there seems to be often a division between social justice action and ecological action, as if the two were not interconnected. And he speaks about how the moment we accept the other as connected to us, whether that other is an otter or an oak tree, or the other is from a culture or class that's different from us, we are doing God's work. We are breaking down the barriers that the the harmful political forces are trying to erect between us. And what I loved about what he had to say is that these things are not in opposition, that that every time, that diversity in all of its forms, whether cultural or ecological, is the thing that we're aiming for here. And embracing the other in all of its forms, including the other that scares us, including addressing the other that, whether that's people and beliefs that we find uncomfortable or parts of nature that we find uncomfortable, that communicating and conversing with whatever the other is in our lives is all an act of restoring the environment, is all an act of fighting for social justice. It's all of a piece.
Mm-hmm. I love that. Thank you.
I think that's important. I think that's really important to remember that connection. I feel like, you know, when you say, how do you fight for the environment in our capitalistic patriarchal culture, it means fighting against that capitalistic patriarchal culture as well.
Yeah, I think it's also just, it's so easy to think about the scale of the problems and then just get really overwhelmed. Speaking for myself, at least, you know, if I hear a question like that and I'm like, oh God, like I don't know. I want like an instant answer. I'm such a Virgo. I just want to like press a button and fix it. But realizing that very small things that we can do matter, that connecting with other people, with the other, as Terry said, was it occupying narrative that Marina Warner said, which I love. That's so good. There are so many different avenues, I think, into this question. And I think for me, not immediately giving in to like the overwhelm of the scope is probably the most important thing, because if you don't do that, then you can keep incrementally doing something. Daisy, I see your hands up.
Yeah, I can lower my head now. Just echoing what everyone else has said, and I think that my kind of talk hopefully addressed that by the time, because I see this question was posted like early on, so I hope that added to thinking about it as well. But as something I think a lot about as like a comparative studies student, which is like, how do we form what we are comparing to? So when we think of the other, there's also the self, and what does that dichotomy do, and how can we be critical of that and kind of untangle it? So something that's really helped me is thinking with affect theory or other theories about how we are constantly interacting in unknowable and unimaginable ways all of the time with our space and our environment. So I feel like there's no way you can't acknowledge things, like you have to acknowledge things that are outside your sphere, whatever your world is, as like worlds that are bumping into each other all of the time. That's not to say that it has to be like a validating or not validating experience. Like there's so much, there's so much heat in a lot of the ways that we talk about that I almost like think that like a community-centered or connection that centers like the relationship to the thing rather than the thing existing on itself and doing things to others, like what is your relationship to that, is a far more interesting question, and that can kind of help to undo some of that too. But we might be getting a little too theoretical. But I second what everybody else said too.
Oh, I love that, Daisy. Thank you. Peggy.
Hi, just thinking about objects and the viewer's question. Here in Maine, the moose are such an iconic animal. And one of the things we can do is to take a look at our own environment and tell the stories of what's happening to something in our environment that we treasure. The tourist literature still shows pictures of lots of moose that you can see when you travel the roads of Maine. But if I had longer time and space, I could share with you the stories of grief that those of us living here in the Western Maine Mountains feel, because we're not seeing the moose anymore. This is a result of the warming climate and ticks moving into Maine and literally drinking the blood of moose so that they don't survive the winters and the babies don't either. These are powerful stories that we have at our hand, our personal stories of seeing the change, not seeing the moose, so that our stories can be used to let people know that this is happening in our environment.
Over on this side of the Atlantic, some people, Sharon Blackie, Martin Shaw, and other people working with myth are saying that we need to restore the land as well as rewild the land. And I think that goes along with what you were saying, Peggy.
Mm.
I love that. Okay.
Does anyone have anything else they want to add to this before we keep going? I don't think we're going to get to all of these questions. There's so many, but I want to give everyone a shot. Okay, thank you.
I would like to jump ahead to Anna Perkins' question. So she asks, what is the relationship or difference between romanticizing, relationality, and or making sacred in terms of making daily life more meaningful? So
that's interesting.
I think it's an interesting question. So how do you know the difference between if you're just romanticizing something or if you're actually making it sacred? Or any other way you might want to interpret this question?
Maria?
Well, I'll jump in on this one.
Like, this is your jam.
Yeah, I got this. So I think, and this is interesting because I actually think it ties into the question about the environment, which is, if we want to come up with two contrasting terms, we have romanticizing, where sometimes that can also lead us to romanticize toxic things, or sort of, we've talked today about the unhealthy stories that get told that reinforce systemic oppression and all sorts of bad things. To contrast that, we have, like, from the, to steal a word from environmentalists, we have rewilding. So you have people writing about not only rewilding the environment, but also rewilding the soul. So I think, when I have to kind of check in with myself, I think about, okay, am I romanticizing something? And by romanticizing, am I looking at it through rose-colored glasses and kind of ignoring any red flags or problems, or just kind of maybe in denial about some things I don't want to feel or deal with? Or am I getting my hands dirty, like gardening or replanting things? Am I doing the hard work of rewilding? And if you're rewilding over romanticizing, I think that's where the relationality comes in, because it requires an element of vulnerability and honesty, because you're having to feel some pretty tough feels sometimes, even when you're looking at the sacred or engaging with it, or especially because you are. And you're having to do that work. So it may feel joyful, it may feel beautiful, but it also feels like labor. So I think of it like in terms of romance novel cliches. There's a lot of cliches we can look at there, but for a lot of people, what we think of when we think of a traditional romance novel like a Bodice Ripper is actually not what we personally find romantic or enjoyable. So that's where we get back to rewilding, right? Undoing those narratives that people tell us this is what should make you happy or what should lead to a healthy relationship versus what actually works for you as a human being. So when the relationality part of that comes in is when you're, tending your relationship to self and to others. But as so many people have brilliantly said, so much better than myself, not just your relationship to self and other human beings, but your relationship to nature, to your environment, to all the other life forms around you. And that is when we find the moment of the sacred, where I think of it, for drawing on psychological terms, Jung and Otis, I'm forgetting his name now, but they talk about the numinous. What happens when you are in the therapy room or a room where you're just being open and vulnerable? Magic happens, insight, growth that wouldn't otherwise happen if you weren't willing to be a little vulnerable and messy. And that can show up in daily life as well, when you're just saying, I'm choosing to engage in this magic. So I'll leave it there. Didn't mean to be too long-winded.
No, that's great. Thank you so much.
I love that answer. I think that's fascinating. And I think you're right. There's something about doing the work, about getting in there and getting, the dirty, bad parts of things too, and embracing all of it.
I also feel like, oh, go ahead.
No, so you go, Sarah. Go on.
Okay, well, I was just going to say, I felt like some of that could also dovetail with what Gina talked about in her talk, in terms of like knowing if we have, a harmful story or one that can be, used powerfully for good. Like if everything, if you go down through her criteria and you can check everything off, then, why not romanticize it? I guess, if you've checked for red flags, I suppose. But I thought that was a cool connection between what Maria and Gina were talking about. Terry, please go ahead.
Oh, just a short thing, which Maria, that what you're talking about reminded me about how so many sacred traditions that I've known, been permitted to participate in, are about relationship, like you say. They're about bringing these numinous experiences back. You go on the vision quest, but then you bring it back to the tribe, back to the people. And when people romanticize the sacred, very often they forget that part, that it's not a psychological quest to better yourself to do these things. It's about to bring something back for the community, the more than human community, your personal community, and when that gets lost, the sacred gets lost.
Thank you.
Absolutely. I just wanted to say that is so beautifully put. the idea that the sacred is relational. You can't separate the two at all. Yeah.
All right. Shall we move on to the next one? Okay. So Sindera wants to know, looking for more fairy tales where girls fall in love with girls, boys with boys, and other non-default gender norms and tales. Can you please direct me on where to find more of these tales? I feel like we can have fun answering this one.
I'll start.
Gina.
I was going to say, I know, Gina.
Yeah. Let's go, Gina.
Yeah, so one of my favorite tale collections is Kissing the Witch by Emma Donoghue. It has primarily women-centered fairy tales, some more platonic, some more romantic, and so on. So that's a great starting point if you don't know it. In terms of other works, I'm really enjoying the fairy tale retellings by S.T. Lin. Cinderella is one, Mermaid is another. They're Black trans retellings of fairy tales set in sort of fantasy-ish settings. Those are really lovely. And you'll find a lot of them just being published in random places on the internet these days. There are just a lot of queer fairy tale retellings happening, and I'm sure I'll think of more as we go on, but I wanted to start with those two.
Yeah, Kissing the Witch is great. That's one that Brittany and I have taught like a million times, and it's really wonderful. So definitely start there.
A lot of more. Sorry, just like as soon as I turn off my mic, I'm like, oh wait, there's more. The book Cinderella is Dead by Kaylin Bayron is another fantastic queering of fairy tales. Ash by Melinda Lowe, another queer Cinderella, very lovely. And if you haven't read The Magic Fish, which is a graphic novel by Trung Le Nguyen, it is a gorgeous interweaving of a coming out story with a coming to America story and fairy tales enmeshed all throughout. So
I'll also add Silver in the Wood by Emily Tesh is really great. Also the work of Anna Marie McLemore. The first one of hers that I read, or of theirs, was When the Moon Was Ours, which is really beautiful. And I think there are several others now. Those are just the first ones.
Yeah, Through a Brazen Mirror by Delia Sherman.
Oh, yes, that's a good one.
In the early 90s, but you can still find copies. Does wonderful things with gender and queer issues. But, you know,
Okay.
a lot of the things that are just mentioned are by and about women. I'm having a harder time thinking of queer fairy tales for men.
Well, it's less fairy tale, it's fantasy, but I'm thinking of it because we just read it for book club, but is Carry On by Rainbow Rowell, which is delightful and so much fun. We also read that in book club recently. And Silver in the Wood also.
There's also a good collection of essays by men on fairy tales, Brothers and Beasts, edited by Kate Bernheimer. And that's got some really good material in it too.
It's fantastic.
If you're looking for more traditional fairy tales, I'd recommend looking tales that fall under the ATU number or grouping of the shift in sex, because those stories are, you know, traditional stories, but they deal with a lot of these issues in interesting ways. And would be a good place to look for it in more older stories, I guess.
Yeah, our friend Psyche Reddy, I think her master's thesis is about this, and I think it's available to read online for free. So if you really want to geek out, it's a great thesis, and you'll learn so much about that tale type, that collection of stories. I definitely learned a lot from that one. And one of the versions of it is called Belle Belle, and that's by Madame d'Aulnoy. So it's a very old French fairy tale, but it's delightful. There are many other ones too. So yeah, you can check out like that whole body of fairy tales. Yeah. Okay, that'll at least get you started.
Yes. Also, we've had a lot of questions in the Q&A that are just about, like, can we get presentation slides? Can we get the names of things and stuff like that? Absolutely. We're going to put together a follow-up email that will hopefully include all of these things. So if you are looking for that, don't worry, we have seen your requests and we will definitely try to put everything in there that we can remember.
Okay, I want to know the answer to this one too. This is a question for Peggy. Oh, where did it go? Yes, what is the background to those bronzed baby shoes? I've never heard of this tradition before. Is this a particular American thing?
I don't know the way back history, because from what I've read, bronzing objects is as old as 5,000 BC. Did they do baby shoes then? I don't know. But what I could find is on one of my slides, Sarah, that a woman in Ohio, I think it is, in 1934, saw a bronze baby shoe in a department store window and started a company. And it's from her interest that the practice of getting these bronze baby shoes really took flight in the United States. And you can Google bronze baby shoes now. There's still companies that do it. I was surprised to find out. But my parents made those for me. You know, made one for me in 1949 and 1950. And the practice was especially alive during those baby boom baby years, 40s, 50s. But it's still there now. I like to think of why my parents ordered just one. And perhaps it's because on the first slide of mine today, you saw the other one, the real one. They wanted me to have a bronzed one and the real shoe. And it was also less expensive to bronze just one. And that would have been necessary for them to pay attention to.
Fascinating, thank you.
Yeah.
A lot of people are asking whether the speakers' papers will be available to read again afterwards. We will check in with our speakers and see, and we will let you guys know in our follow-up email.
Yeah. I love this question, so I'm going to ask it. This is from Mary Meth Green. She says, I would like to know each scholar author's favorite character for embodying resistance.
Ooh, I love that.
Everybody went, ooh, at the same time. Oh, Daisy.
All right, Daisy.
I don't know if I have like the best answer to this one, but I saw it in the chat, so I was thinking about it, and so this is like the only character that I keep coming back to. This is a series that's popular basically everywhere but the United States. The Moomin Troll like series, Moomins.
Oh yeah.
I'm really interested in it. I've spent a lot of time watching it. It's kind of romantic fairy tale-esque, but it's based on a graphic novel by a queer a queer woman named Tova Janssen. It's really great. Look it up. Very cool. There's a character named Snufkin in it who Snufkin is very cute. For basically like what you might imagine a sort of trickster, sort of magic helper, sort of like figure that kind of leaves and comes back all the time, but is always like staunchly rebellious to the sort of power structures that the Moomin's family comes in contact with. Absolute ally. Looks kind of like a small human who's dressed in green. And so I always like watching episodes where Snufkin actually does an action to help the Moomins get out of whatever kind of like oppressive moment that they might be under, whether it's like a police officer or a traveler who's trying to do something unfortunate to the place, whatever. It's really cool.
I love that.
Maria.
So I actually have two, and one will be quick. Since I mentioned it earlier, hobbits, amazing. There's that, quote that always goes around, that Gandalf says, if more people valued like good food and cheer, we wouldn't have a lot of these problems. And, if we're thinking of like resistance as an everyday act, this idea of really tuning into community and celebrating relationships, including with nature, I think it's a really beautiful way to do it. I also, and this one might seem a little counterintuitive, one of my favorite fairy tales is The Brave Little Tailor. And it's basically about this guy who wins the day by just being really clever and thinking past traditional narratives. So he develops this reputation, people are like, oh, he's this fearless warrior. He killed 7 in one blow. And it turns out it was like 7 flies on a jar of jam, but people kind of start weaving the story, and he, squeezed rocks and made water come out, but it turns out it was just like some cheese and milk came out. But what I think is so great about this story, and in terms of connecting it to this idea of resistance, is the tailor is just really thinking about, here's what this normative structure is, here's how this story is going to go, or here's what's expected of me. How can I subvert or question or play into these norms in order to create some sort of change? And of course, his change is, he gets the princess and becomes really rich. So, we also have to question those structures there. But it's really about reimagining these mundane objects that can suddenly become magical and turn into this interesting story. So I always think of him, and when I get stuck on something and I start feeling a little too literal about how to create change or whatever, I start imagining, well, how might the brave little tailor reimagine this situation and maybe find a better solution, or some sort of way to fight a giant without actually having to come to blows. So for what that's worth.
I love that. Gina.
I am really a fan of the youngest daughter in Fitcher's Bird, the Grimm's Tale, where this sorcerer like kidnaps one sister and then the next and the next. And so it's sort of like a Bluebeard tale where when, the oldest 2 sisters fail the task by going into the forbidden chamber and dropping the egg and it gets bloody or whatever. And the youngest sister, she sort of sees through this ruse, this fidelity test or faithfulness test, as we call the motif in folklore studies. And so she's able to, like, through curiosity and understanding kind of what lies beneath the surface, she's able to outwit the sorcerer, save her sisters, and then like outwit like everybody else by disguising herself as a bird and putting a skull in the window that everyone thinks is like, oh, it's the bride getting ready for, which I think is also says a lot about marriage. But I really like the fact that she is curiosity driven and rewarded for it, and that she is able to see below the surface. And I think that's also part of why I'm really drawn to things like structuralism and understanding narrative structure and patterns. Is once you know how to do it, it empowers you. I'm very much like a knowledge is power kind of person. And also I like that she just goes for it. I'm also kind of a it's better to ask forgiveness than permission person, which has had mixed results in my life, but I like that this fairy tale gives us a very bold, brave, inquisitive, and like smart, discerning protagonist.
Peggy, did you want to say something? Thought I saw your hand go up.
Sure.
Okay.
Like Maria, I have two. One is probably obvious to most people. You know, it's all kinds of fur, Alalairal, and also, of course, the woman in the seal legend. Very much the same women who have a big challenge in front of them, whether it's running away from incest or being captured, and they wait covered with a fur and hidden until they know they're ready, and this knowing comes to them, and then they can act. But the image also before my eyes is from White Bear, King Valamon, of the woman sitting on the back of the bear as they run off through the snow of the Norwegian wood. And the story begins with the princess who wants above all things this beautiful golden wreath that she's seen in her dreams. She sees one, it's not it. She sees another. People keep bringing her wreaths. It's not the same. And then she's out one day in the winter and she sees this white bear, and in its paws is the golden wreath. So what happens in your life when the thing you most desire you see in the paws, in the claws of a bear? So those two things.
I love that. I love how everybody's answers brings out something different about what resistance means to them too. I think this is really, I love seeing this.
What's your favorite, Brittany?
Well, I was sitting here thinking, I mean, I've made arguments in the past that about how much I love Sleeping Beauty and how I feel like she gets a bad rap, but in her passivity, in her sleep, in her removing herself from the world and sort of being on her own, even if it's in her dreams for a while, and not sort of taking the role she's supposed to take for 100 years, I feel like there is a kind of resistance in that. I feel like there's a kind of embracing of being, resting, of taking care of yourself. And I like that part of it. And then the other one I thought of is, of course, where we got the name the Carterhaugh School, is Janet from Tamlin, who is another one of both Sarah and I's favorite characters, who starts off the story completely defiant. She's going to go into the Carterhaugh woods no matter what, because it's hers and she wants to go. And so she's going to go. And then by the end of the story, she's hanging on to the guy she wants to marry as he transforms into all kinds of different horrible critters and fire and other things like that. And yet she hangs on. And I think she's an incredible character and very inspiring on the resistance front too.
She faces down a fairy queen too.
I know, exactly. I mean, that takes guts right there.
I know, you don't want to mess with those.
What about you, Sarah?
Well, obviously Janet also, but like my answer, Brittany knows this already, but is probably Snow White. And that's an answer where a lot of y'all are probably like, are you kidding me? Like she just sleeps in a coffin. It's, kind of Sleeping Beauty-esque also. But I mean, this girl just won't die. Like her stepmother keeps trying to kill her over and over and over. And in the Grimm version, at least, she's only 7 years old at the beginning of the story. And the fact that she just keeps surviving no matter what, you know, when she, by all rights, absolutely should not, I find very inspirational. And also, I'm apparently cosplaying as Snow White today, so I have to give that as my answer. Have we heard from Terry on this one?
Oh gosh, my mind is flitting through all sorts of stories. Personal favorites are Many Fair and The Seven Swans. But the first thing I thought of was the fairy tales and the fairy godmothers in French fairy tales, because the oral tradition they were drawing from did not really include many such figures. They kind of made them up. I mean, that's a broad generalization, but they certainly popularized the notion of fairy godmothers. And this was in the 17th century French salons which were the fairy tale salons were run by women at a time when women of their class were very severely constrained. And they created a space for women to have agency, to tell stories. And they use these stories very often to talk about things they weren't allowed to talk about in public, and particularly in the context of the French court, like the dangers of arranged marriages. And it's been pointed out by fairy tale scholars that the fairy godmother characters in those fairy tales very often are stand-in for the women of the salons themselves, yes, guiding younger women through the maze of problems they were going to encounter in this very patriarchal society. So I just want to root for those fairy godmothers who at their core are not what Disney, twinkly Disney characters. They're these women helping other women. And resistance for me doesn't get better than that.
Awesome. I love this. This is a great question. Thank you so much, Mary Beth.
Maddie wants to know, Maria, if you could tell us again the name of the La Llorona fairy tale that you wrote, I think.
Yes, so it's called Weep, Woman, Weep. And thank you for asking. I appreciate that.
Also, Kate Wolford said some lovely things about it in the Q&A, which you should definitely look at, Maria. Okay, so I saw one. Okay, I feel like this is a really important question, and we're getting to the end of our time. But Stephanie wants to know, how do we approach things when we feel like they are hopeless? Like we literally don't have enough energy to move the mountains we have to move. I feel like that's a question where a lot of us probably are right now. Well, I feel like Maria's talk spoke quite directly to some of that in terms of, we really have to take care of ourselves so that we can, keep going. And I know this is something that I really struggle with personally. I just want to be, go, go, go all the time, try and deal with everything as directly as I can. But if we don't, refill our own wells, then you literally can't do anything. And that is something that I have to work very hard to hang on to. So, I guess my initial response is, if you can't for a minute, then you can't. I think that means you need to stop and care for yourself. And in some of the ways that our wonderful speakers have described, there are a lot of different possible strategies for trying to replenish your well, whether that's focusing on pleasure, like Maria said, connecting the way that Daisy talked about, and other things from our other speakers too that I think could be really powerful.
Or just taking a rest, like Sleeping Beauty.
Yeah, just
but allowing yourself to do that. Yeah.
Gina.
Yeah, as someone who's recently been experiencing burnout, I really like the book called Burnout by the Nagoski sisters, Emily and Amelia Nagoski. And so one of the things I got out of reading that was, first off, just feeling seen in your burnout and being like, oh, it's not just me being overworked and anxious like usual, to know that it is systemic, it is patterned, it is often intentionally perpetuated by those with power. So we're not at fault for needing rest, for needing to back off. And so one of the things I've been doing to kind of work through mine is I say no to a lot of stuff, which feels weird. And especially if you're socialized feminine, it's like, oh yes, oh I'd love to, oh thanks for thinking of me, kind of a thing. And I've gotten to where I am in my career by also saying yes to lots of things, including like weird things. Like, I have one of the first folklore blogs that people were really like talking about, and on the internet. Of course, there are other folklore bloggers and folklorists on Twitter and the internets, but so I say yes to lots of random opportunities and things that don't necessarily advance your CV in the university setting, and that's just been my habit for decades. And so learning to say no and take a step back and prioritize rest and try to get that should voice out of your head. Oh, well, I should do this, I should do that. If you just start catching yourself every time there's a should in your head or in your voice, that might be one way to draw attention to the things that are draining you, so that hopefully you can reframe some of that. And like, obviously we all have responsibilities and obligations. We can't just put everything down all the time, but it might help to reframe some of the things that maybe you're taking on that you don't absolutely have to take on.
I think that's incredibly important. And also, as you were saying it, I was thinking, oh, I should really pay more attention to my shoulds. And then I was like, oh, God. But you're absolutely right. I mean, I also struggle very much with saying no to things. So relatable. Peggy.
One thing her query makes me think of is the way that I play in my head stories of women who've been very important to me in my life. My grandmother Yogam, for example, one of my first folklore teachers, Raina Green, and I have particular events that happen in their lives every day, kinds of things. But when I think that I can't do something, I call those stories up about these women and remind me of them, and that helps.
It's beautiful. Maria.
I thought sorry.
And then Terry.
Okay, thank you. So one thing I'll add to this that everyone else has said, and particularly in terms of healing our relationship to pleasure, like I talked about, is I think we have to start redefining our relationship to success. So, and again, I feel like I'm really preaching to the choir here, but I am someone who has a lot of fire energy. I put my mind to it, get it done. I see a problem in my institution, I fix it, and I work. I'm very action oriented, and it's a system that can reward that over work, or if not reward, then really validate it and romanticize. That's a really good example of like a toxic romanticization, right? Romanticizing that over work. And so much of it is because you're doing it for your community, you're doing it to advance social justice issues. And so you can get caught in this cycle of overextending yourself in order for a good cause. But for me personally, when the pandemic happened, a lot of stuff came to a screeching halt for me. And I had to realize that part of my overwork was also so that I could avoid dealing with certain things. I was very competent in a lot of areas of my life, and there were other areas that I needed to spend more time on. But because it was so easy to work and just plug and play certain things, I kind of got into this, train track that I could just go on indefinitely unless there was some sort of disruption. So part of me, like in the pandemic, as everyone has said, I've had to learn how to say no so that I could say yes to other things. So I think we have to remember that part of saying no is saying yes to another part of yourself and another part of your life that you want to breathe more energy into. And that can be a very painful realization and a very painful thing to work through, but it's also ultimately can be transformative and healing, because you're also saying yes to pleasure, yes to things that don't require some sort of output or concrete thing that you can show, some sort of product. And so the last thing I'll say about that is, for me, because I'm someone who can also feel like guilty if I step back from things. So I have to remind myself, you know, especially in these years of talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, I have to say, you know, is it equitable if things are happening through the exploitation of my labor? Or, you know, is it equitable? Am I setting a good example for my students? I work in a place with a large Indigenous and Hispanic populations. Am I setting a good example for my students if I'm one of the few people in faculty who look like them and I'm burned out, or my life is not as full as it can be? Professionally, it's successful, but maybe I need to work on other things. So social justice there becomes, am I modeling a whole fulfilling life? So I think it's useful to redefine what success is and what it feels like, especially if you are in a profession that asks you to kind of be in your head and all the time. That's why I talk a lot about embodying and feeling these sorts of things.
It's so important. Thank you. Okay, I think that brings us to time.
Wait, Sarah. Terry wanted to talk, remember?
Oh, right, of course. Sorry, please, Terry, go ahead. Take as much time as you want.
What Maria said that I've totally forgotten. I wanted to speak to, as a woman in my elder years, and also as someone who is health disabled, to other people who might be one or both of those categories. One of the things that causes me despair in these dark times is that I feel unable to get out there on the front lines, you know, working as I did when I was younger for, you know, again, for abortion rights, for, you know, to be out there being an activist. And when I'm in my studio writing and editing and thinking the world is going up in flames, and why is it right that I should be back here doing what I do when there are such important issues to handle? And in my younger days, I could do both. And now, you know, I'm health disabled. I can't go out on the front line. So my friend Ellen Kushner told me this thing that I'm going to pass on to you. And I've been saying it a lot lately because I think it's so wise. She said, you know, in every war, there are people on the front line and there are people in the back lines making the soup to feed the front line. And your job was once on the front line, but now you're making the soup. That's important too. So for all of you who really want to be out there fighting these fights, but just can't because of age, disability, family commitments, caring commitments, everything you do in a small way in your personal lives, in your art, in your creation of family community, well, everything you do is making the soup. And that's important too.
That is perfect.
Perfect. Yes,
perfect note to end on. Yes.
We literally could not end on a more perfect note. That is such an important reminder. And I think I'm literally going to write it like on a Post-it note and like stick it on my laptop so that I don't forget it. Thank you so much, Terry. And thank you so much, all of you. Well, thank you, Ellen, too.
Thank you, Ellen, too. Thank you all for being here. You all gave such amazing talks, and I just am so delighted at how different everything was and how many wonderful things came to the table. And I just can't thank you all enough for being part of this.
Yes, thank you so much. Like, I feel like I literally don't even have the words, but you were all wonderful and brilliant. And thank you for everything you brought to our roundtable today. I know, as we knew you guys were going to bring it. We will say very quickly before we go that if you enjoyed this conversation, we'll be doing a lot more in this vein in our upcoming course, which is open for enrollment. It is also titled Folklore and Resistance. It's another iteration of our Rapunzel's Circle series that is all about using fairy tales and folklore to address the world around us,
as it is.
The world in a very immediate way. We've been sending emails about that. We would love to have you. If you have any questions, let us know. Otherwise, please join us again in thanking our incredible Roundtable participants. You all are wonderful and brilliant. Thank you so much.
And look for the follow-up email from us with as many links and things as we can put together.
Yeah, as many things as we can reconstruct.
Yes. All right. Thank you all.
Thank you, Brittany and Sarah. Thank you for putting this together.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you for being here. All of you. Thank you so much.